great numbers today, which is really good to see. I'm going to get started. My name is Jason Petticone. I'm the president and co-founder of the Paideia Institute, and welcome to the latest installment in our online public lecture series. I'm very happy to and excited about today's lecture, and happy to have the opportunity to introduce my friend and colleague, Dani Bostick. So Dani probably doesn't need an introduction for many of you, but I would be remiss not to rehearse some of her accomplishments. Most saliently, 15 years of teaching experience in as a high school Latin teacher. She's also a scholar who is exploring the congruence of traditional classics pedagogy and structures of white supremacy, most notably and noticeably in a recent article in AJP. She has a TED Talk and has spoken in the TED-Ed Innovative Educator forum. And she's also a member of the Teacher Advisory Council for the National Humanities Center. So we feel very honored to have such an accomplished scholar and activist as our next speaker in the free online public lecture series. And looking forward to hear more from Dani today on the topic of what can ancient literature teach us about coping with trauma. So Dani's going to talk, and then we will do a question and answer series after the talk. And you can, when we get to that point, you can either just write your question in the chat and then I'll read it out, or you can raise your hand and ask your question live. Okay, so Dani, thanks for being here, and take it away.
All right, well, thanks for having me. Jason and Claire, thanks for organizing this. When the date came up, it seemed really far away, and all of a sudden it's almost March. So thank you for coming. And I hope that at least, what I have to share maybe gets you thinking about the Aeneid a little bit differently, maybe it helps you think about trauma a little bit differently. So that's sort of my goal today. And I'm also very interested to hear, your perspectives and maybe different readings, especially of the Aeneid. So I guess when we think about trauma, most people think about PTSD, and I have a lot of presentations on trauma, and typically I sort of take for granted that, oh, we're talking about trauma, we must be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the Aeneid, reading the Aeneid, has really helped me look at trauma in a completely different way. And as somebody who's been diagnosed with PTSD, I think in many ways it was more helpful for me to read the Aeneid and that representation of trauma than a lot of the resources I had used, especially when my PTSD was very acute. So I think a reason why our thoughts about trauma are so narrow, and why sometimes thinking about trauma in the context of ancient texts and ancient people, I think a reason why that tends to sort of be sometimes controversial is just because we're looking at trauma from a medical model. So you have trauma as something really horrible that happens, something that could, where there's risk of death, risk of injury, actual death. And then there's this whole constellation of symptoms that, in the DSM-5 that we're probably familiar with because of veterans. That's usually the context that we hear about PTSD. So on the 4th of July, we hear be careful about fireworks because it might remind veterans of gunfire. And it tends to be a pretty superficial representation of trauma and a pretty superficial engagement of trauma. And it's also a very medical engagement of trauma. So I will say that when my PTSD was acute, I think medicine saved my life. PTSD is a life-threatening condition. It's a debilitating condition, but there's many people living with the effects of trauma who cannot relate to a list of symptoms in the DSM-5, or once the worst of it passes, there's still something there that feels different. I tend to compare it to gravity, where we're not just, well, nobody comments on gravity. If I ask, I'm a teacher, if I ask my students how they are, or, you know, morning check-in, what good happened over the weekend, nobody mentions gravity. They're not like, it was really cool because I was walking and didn't float away. It's just sort of there. It's something where the effects are pervasive, but it's not necessarily even anything you would name or be able to say, okay, here's how I experience gravity today. It's just something that's a fact of life. So I tend to use that analogy as well. And one of the aspects of trauma that I noticed immediately, or in terms of post-traumatic stress, was the way that it distorts time. So I'm going to read a quote by David Morris. This is in the context of war trauma. My trauma is related to sexual violence. But this was, when I read this, I think it was one of the most helpful perspectives to read, because I thought, you know what, this is not in the DSM-5. I was in mental health counseling school when I realized I had PTSD when I was getting treatment for it. I knew a lot about trauma. I'd read a lot about trauma. And I read a book called The Evil Hours, and this quote, I think of all things, really made me think, wow, I'm not the only one who's experienced this. And before I read it, I think I'd like to add that with COVID, I think a lot of people, especially during the initial lockdown, could relate to some sense of distortion in terms of time, because this quote addresses time. So I think when I first read this, I believe it was 2015, I think over the last few years, a way I experience time as someone who has PTSD, I think has become more common, where during that first lockdown, people were thinking, oh, what day is it? How is it Friday already? Or what time is it? Why am I up at 4 a.m. eating peanuts for my 5th dinner? You know, you just had no structure or sense of stability or anything really anchoring you without the rhythm of the work schedule and normal things that used to happen. So David Morris writes, trauma destroys the fabric of time. In normal time, you move from one moment to the next, sunrise to sunset, birth to death. After trauma, you may move in circles. Find yourself being sucked backwards into an eddy or bouncing about like a rubber ball, from now to then and back again. August is June, June is December. What time is it? Guess again. Another odd feature of traumatic time is that it doesn't just destroy the flow of the present into the future, it corrodes everything that came before, eating at moments from your previous life until you can't remember why any of them mattered. So when I read that quote, it really resonated with me. And later, when I revisited the Aeneid, I think if you've taught the Aeneid, especially to students who haven't really engaged with, you know, mythology assignments and things along the way, it is really disorienting to start sort of in the middle of things, and you're in book 2 flashing back to the Trojan War. You know, there's just a lot going on in terms of time. You're in book 6, and all of a sudden Aeneas is in the underworld, and he can see his descendants and all of their accomplishments before they even existed. So there's definitely, several of my students have described it as trippy, but when you're trying to teach it, it can be really frustrating and disorienting. And I think a way that I used to teach the Aeneid is to try to make sense of it, try to package it up, draw diagrams, try to get some sense of linearity. Look, it's not quite as chaotic and wacky as you think. Here's how it fits together. And I think reading the Aeneid, or particularly the first 6 books, as sort of Aeneas's response to trauma, as a teacher, I'm just, hey, sit there and feel confused, because this is a sense of confusion that people who experience trauma can feel. And I think a lot of Vergil's manipulation of time not just describes Aeneas's experience, but I think he manages to really replicate a common feature of trauma that really isn't included in our common conversation about it, in terms of distortions of time, chaotic sense of time, in some ways just a lack of time. So that's sort of what I'm going to get at today, in terms of how Vergil manipulates time to replicate a common experience related to the trauma and the aftermath of trauma. And David Morris had mentioned wrote the quote I read in 2015. Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor, in his writing spoke of deformed time and a strange time experience among prisoners in concentration camps. Sociologist Kai Erikson, after the 1972 Buffalo Creek flood, mentioned that the residents there had lost their navigational equipment, as it were, both their inner compasses and their outer maps, and the people were unable to locate themselves in time and place. So I wanted to frame our discussion of the Aeneid in terms of trauma, not in terms of does Aeneas fit this diagnosis, because there's certainly a lot out there. I had read one article, did ancient people, were they even upset by violence? You know, just the premise being is violence and the experience of near death or serious injury even traumatic for ancient people. So, I mean, there's a lot we can wonder about, but I think if the advantage that literature presents is it provides an experience, not a list of diagnostic criteria. So, I mean, just to begin with, did Aeneas experience trauma? Was this something traumatic? And just in terms of foundation myths, a scholar, Dominic LaCapra, had asked whether all societies and traditions have trauma as at least a crucial component of a foundational myth of origins. And the entire Aeneid is bracketed by trauma. We meet Aeneas, and he's definitely not a traditional hero. He's groaning, he's cold, he's lifting his hands up. And at the end of the Aeneid, at the very end, we have the episode with Turnus. So the entire Aeneid is bracketed with trauma, and it's with very similar language. So I think that it's fair to say that for Vergil, whether or not he called it trauma or thought, obviously not thinking in terms of a medical model with PTSD, but he's definitely centering both trauma and Aeneas's reaction to it. So one of the episodes of the Aeneid in book one that I had always enjoyed reading, but hadn't really thought much of beyond this is nice, is Aeneas's speech to his people after the shipwreck. And this is where sort of embracing the chaos of book one of the Aeneid when we first start reading with students, just, hey, it's okay to feel confused. This is part of what Vergil's doing and continues to do with his treatment of time. Is his motivational speech to his people. And there's one line in there, it's a common tattoo. It's in a lot of different cultural contexts. It's sort of made its way into the mainstream, but one day we'll look back on this, and a lot of the consequence of that is, and we'll smile and we'll laugh. If you think about what Aeneas went through, there's nothing there that you would smile or laugh at. Maybe it's pleasant, but I don't think it's pleasant in the way of, hey, we'll look back on this one day and have a good laugh about it or feel good about the actual trauma. I think there's things where you can use humor to cope with it. I think there's obviously episodes in people's lives that are difficult at the time. And then you could just really think, wow, that was something we went through and that just seemed like such a big deal, and look at us now. But for example, I'm a victim of child sexual abuse. There's nothing about that I would ever look back on and smile or laugh about. I have students, I mean, many of you probably know people, maybe you yourself have experienced trauma on a cultural level, trauma where your country is falling apart, you're fleeing. None of that is something that you would think, yeah, remember that time we left our parents and never went back and never saw them again. So I think that there's a way that Yuwabit, which is often translated please, is better translated as help. And a way that it just dawned on me that this actually makes more sense as I was auditing. I went to Catholic University and I went back to audit. I audited a class with my favorite professor, and a student was translating this and had translated Yuwabit as will help. And I just thought, oh, that's wrong. And as soon as I thought that, I actually thought, you know what, that really makes so much more sense. And I had a little notebook and I just started writing down ideas about this. So the reason I'm bringing up this speech is because it is at a pretty key position in book one. And the themes in the speech are really echoed throughout the Aeneid, particularly the first the first 6 books. So what I believe Aeneas is presenting here is a blueprint for, I hate to use the word processing, but kind of living with trauma. How do we go from being stuck to moving forward? And he certainly does move forward when he's able to, you know, kind of pull himself together and found the Roman people. So I think a lot of my thoughts on Vergil's treatment of trauma, or even the fact that he is addressing trauma, hinges on Aeneas's speech in book 1, 198, lines 198 to 207. And I think it hinges on the fact that what he is saying is that one day we will, maybe we'll be able to look back on these things and it will be helpful. So I think what he's providing here is a way to take this sort of time jumble. What year is it? Is it 1985? Why am I 36 and I feel like I'm 8 again? Take that jumble of time where the past, present kind of merge together and you really can't even look ahead to the future. So on a very basic level, the aftermath of trauma is a disorder of time. Even if you're looking at it from a medicalized model, you have flashbacks, you know, you have trouble planning, functioning, moving ahead. I think what he's saying is, you know, you've gotten through it when you're able to remember it, because that's something that will be helpful. And even the act of remembering implies willful recall instead of the past invading your future. So there were a couple things in this speech that stuck out to me once I read that word as will help. And not many. I wrote an article for Paideia's publication about this word a couple years ago, and I just think about it all the time. So I ended up writing, I have a book chapter in a volume that just came out on the Aeneid. I mean, there's just, it really just sort of changed the way I really looked at the Aeneid as a whole. But when he's saying we are not ignorant of bad things that have happened before. So he's acknowledging we've had bad things that have happened before. We've suffered worse things. And he mentions some specific things that they had suffered. And now he's saying, hey, we've been through this. We know how to do this. Pull yourselves together and banish. And the phrase he uses is maestum timorum. So he's banishing this, this sorrowful fear. And then right at that point, he's saying one day it'll be helpful to remember these things. So then he, at that point, orients them to the future. So he recalls past events that they've gotten through before. He gives them this directive. He says, one day we'll be able to look back on this and it will be helpful. So he's providing a context for this. There's going to be a day where we're not in it. It's going to be part of our past. And not only are we not in it physically, but it's going to be something that we can recall instead of having it live with us. And that's when he orients them towards the future. And he says, you know, we're striving for Latium, and, you know, there's better things waiting for us there. So this was, when I read that as help, I said, yes, that really would be helpful, because after a traumatic experience, it's extremely easy to get bogged down in it. And a lot of times, the way that trauma is remembered, it's not even remembered, it's really re-experienced. And when Dido asks Aeneas to tell this story, they're all sitting around at dinner. She's like, hey, how about you tell us about this Trojan War? You know, he's saying, you're making me renew an unspeakable sadness. And one problem with trauma is that sometimes it's even hard to ascribe words to that experience. It's more of a state that just sits with a person. It's not something that one can necessarily ascribe words to. And as he's recounting it, there's a line, horresco referens, he's having a physical response, recounting this in fondum dolorem. And he's saying renew. How would you renew that? It's as if he is re-experiencing it at that time. So he, of all people, would understand what that would mean to be able to get to the point where you can remember it and where that remembering is helpful. And I think the helpful element there is organizing the experience in terms of a distinct past, present, and future, instead of dealing with this jumbled time. And one note in terms of I mean, and if I'm curious about your perspectives on, okay, was this trauma? Did the ancients experience trauma? I read a paper that said because they didn't have explosive devices when they fought in war, they didn't get the TBIs, so they wouldn't have experienced PTSD to the same extent that modern people do. The population with the highest rate of the medicalized PTSD are victims of sexual violence. There were not bombs going off around me when I was being sexually abused. So I have no TBI, and most victims of sexual violence do not. So I found that argument less than compelling. But I do know there's an argument of, should we, as modern people, impose our values and our perspectives on trauma on ancient people, or cultures that are different from the one in which we live. I thought that the phrase maestum timorem really does describe trauma. Timorem is obvious. It's a kind of fear that is a future-oriented emotion in terms of hope as a positive version looking forward to the future. Fear is having apprehension towards what's coming, to the point that it can constrict the future possibilities or even a sense of future. Catullus used the word. Catullus obviously informed a lot of Vergil's writing, and Catullus used that word quite a bit, but in the most devastating circumstances. So he used that term in his poem to his, or a poem referencing his brother, 65. Ariadne uses that word. I mean, some of the most kind of heart-wrenching, poetry, and I personally think in Latin literature use that word to describe extreme loss. Aeneas only uses the word in the context of some of his biggest losses. So it's not like they're throwing around the word maestus. It's not just sad. So he used it chronologically. So not all of it is coming before Aeneas's speech, but chronologically, if you're looking at a timeline of events, he used it 6 times to talk about significant losses. So before he speaks to his people, he's used this word 6 times. One involved the funeral of Polydorus. 2 involved the loss of his wife when he realized she was gone. I have translated that word despondent. So, despondent, I called out for Crisa again and again. He used it twice in the context of Hector, which, I occasionally try to resurrect my ancient Greek. And last time I did, I read that scene, from the Iliad, and I just thought, why am I reading anything else? This is the pinnacle. It's obviously so sad. So he's using this word in extremely, extremely tragic circumstances, and that is the same word he's telling his people. He's saying, release this maestum timorem. So in terms of a defense of this being trauma and not just some type of hard event, I think that would justify the way Catullus had used it with his brother and Ariadne, and then also with Polydorus, Hector, and Crisa. Another point I think is worth mentioning in terms of the word maestus is that Aeneas also, in terms of Polydorus, Hector, and Crisa, those are people that he encountered as ghosts. So if you think of Western attitudes towards ghosts, it's flaky. I mean, I think of the ways I've thought of ghosts before, and it's very judgmental because I don't know where everybody's located now, but in the United States, we're supposed to be rational, intellectual. Of course, there's no ghosts. So ghosts themselves are a distortion of time. And I think one problem with some of the ways, at least on the secondary level, that classics has been diffused is that it tends to attract and retain students who are it's sort of a monolithic, usually a monolithic group. And I think that's sort of limited perspectives in the field that could be extremely valuable, because in I have, for this article, went down a ghost rabbit hole. I had final edits to do, and it was sort of like the semicolon type of edits. And then I resubmitted it with a surprise. I was like, surprise, it's 3 pages on ghosts, because I just thought, this, I think, really supports the idea that this maestum timorem is some type of trauma that Aeneas is telling his men to overcome. So in any case, there's a lot of literature about Cambodian refugees, people in Vietnam, just pretty much almost everywhere outside of the United States and Europe. Processing trauma, death, and loss involved ghosts. And in the Aeneid, I think it's significant that when Aeneas, or when this word maestus comes up, it's also associated with ghosts, which I think supports the idea that this is some type of unusual event. It's not just another day in the life of ancient people having bad experiences. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would like to know about that as well. But essentially, he is building a blueprint for his people to be able to create some sense of order out of disorder. And I think that in that regard, help is a key word there versus pleasant. Now, you could say, pleasant would work too, because it is more, for me personally, it's more pleasant to feel grounded on some type of timeline than in some type of, Tasmanian devil or road runner. And that's how I would think about it, just spinning and very disorienting. That is definitely pleasant. But I have seen so many uses of that quote, or so many iterations of it, where we're going to look back on it and smile or laugh. And I think there's just certain types of experiences where that is not a realistic response. And I also think if we're talking about, if we're looking at what happened or what Aeneas has been through in terms of war trauma and other things, it would be, I think, a little bit disrespectful to trivialize that level of trauma in that way and say this is something we're all going to look back on one day and just kind of laugh about. So in any case, he instills hope in the Trojans. So he is establishing the day that they'll have a present, a distinct present, where they can willfully recall the past, and then in saying, hey, we're gonna go to this, there's better things ahead of us, he's instilling hope in them, which could replace that fear. So fear as a future oriented emotion can be replaced by hope. Instead of taking the energy that you're using to sort of make sense of your world, you can use it to build and look forward to a future. And even within the medical model, that's sort of a goal of therapy, getting people functioning and able to enjoy things again and plan, whether it be planning to go to work or planning something longer term. So I think also just in terms of that speech, and I'll give a couple examples before I close out and we have time for some questions or discussion on that. But in terms of the speech itself, I think supporting the idea that this is more help is that he is talking about some specific events that were traumatic. And after he speaks, if he were saying one day it would be pleasant to look back on these things, within his speech, he's using a past traumatic event as something that is helpful, not pleasant. He's saying we've been through this bad thing before and we can do it again. He's using that not to make them laugh or smile, but as a source of motivation and a source of something to build a sense of efficacy on. This is something we've been through before and we can do it again. I would characterize that, if I had to choose one or the other, as helpful. He's trying to get them moving forward. Also, after that speech, he's not happy or smiling either. He did not think about their specific past traumatic event and laugh or smile, or just, after his speech, he's not sitting there having a good feeling. I mean, there's many ways Vergil could have described him sitting there smiling and feeling a sense of calm or whatever. He's faking it. At the end of the speech, he is pretending. He's hiding his pain. He's putting up a front. He's not feeling good. He's not actually feeling good. So I think that Aeneas's own reaction and Aeneas's own use of a past trauma in his speech support the notion that we're looking at something that's helpful, and that the pleasant feeling isn't the goal of overcoming the trauma. It's being able to either leverage it in a constructive way in terms of I've been through something hard and I can do it again, or even just having a narrative. And in terms of the collective identity of the Romans and this as the foundation myth, obviously it's very important to be able to integrate past trauma and recent trauma in terms of what had gone on immediately before, or even to some extent during the period of time that the Aeneid was written. So I think, how are you going to take, in terms of ancient Rome, the civil wars, there's just a lot of death, trauma, instability. When Aeneas, Augustus's nephew, died, oh, are we going back to another period of even more chaos again? There's just a whole lot of uncertainty. And I think what Vergil does in the Aeneid is he's able to take or show this roadmap for personal and collective trauma, because at the point where Aeneas is in the underworld, instead of, for example, when Aeneas looks at the frieze in book 1, he is experiencing them out of order. It's specified that they're in some type of order on the frieze, but when you read the ekphrasis, you are seeing them in a jumbled order. When he gets to book 6, and that's why it's specified books 1 through 6 for this, for the most part, he is seeing his descendants in order. And then when you get to his shield, that is, I believe, 100% in order. So you're going from this sort of chaotic experiencing of events that could be linear to something that is where there is an established chronological order. So I think that Vergil leverages that in terms of both Aeneas and his people, but also in terms of the ancient Roman reader. Also because in book 6, when Aeneas sees he's seeing his future here, and that's supposed to be a source of motivation for him. So that's in a way, something that should drive him forward. And it is a little bit of an odd distortion of time there. But for the ancient Roman reader, they're looking at Marcellus's death, which is a recent event for them and something very disorienting and something that could evoke a lot of fear and uncertainty, especially considering all the violence and just that very recent history of turmoil and chaos. Aeneas sees that and it's like, okay, that's my destiny. This is where I need to go. So it contextualizes a somewhat recent event into the very distant past with Aeneas and provides an instant context and significance. So even though that was a somewhat recent event, collectively Rome could look back on it and say, okay, now that day has come already where they can look back on this event of national significance in terms of Marcellus's death and all the uncertainty that brought, and see immediately that there was some purpose to that, or wow, this is very significant. We can already look back on this, and it's already helpful because we know that this is what motivated Aeneas. The glitch in that is, does Aeneas even remember what he saw when he leaves the underworld? And at first I just thought, well, that might not, what does that mean? And I thought, I don't have to understand everything. But then I realized if he does forget, the only person who would remember that, if Aeneas himself doesn't, is the ancient Roman reader. So that's where you have this significance given to a relatively recent event. And it follows that blueprint of what Aeneas gave to his people, where you could look at that as you're thinking about ancient Roman reader reading that, and the uncertainty, and you have the mausoleum there, and who's gonna what is in store for us right now. And certainly people were alive then who remembered or were continuing to experience, violence and fears of violence. But immediately you can look back on that death and say, okay, this is something that, here's a story where that trauma is part of our foundation. So it provides this artificially ancient context where it is a collapsing of time for Aeneas. He can leave and totally forget it. He doesn't tell regardless of what he remembered, he did not speak of that to anybody. So in a way, the people who are with him in that experience are the ancient Romans, who at that point are able to look back on recent trauma and perhaps consider that helpful. For Aeneas himself, there's similar language when he sees the ghost of Crisa, and she's like, hey, we're going to look forward. So I think that there are examples between the speech and the underworld where you see that same pattern again, in terms of Aeneas going back into the city, realizing his wife has died, seeing her ghost, and then having that mission. And in fact, in terms of the trauma and it being helpful, Hector, I believe, is the first person to inform Aeneas of his destiny, or at least in documented in the order of the Aeneid that Vergil gives us, and his the ghost of his wife is the second. So there's something there where you have this profound loss and war trauma and this way of looking forward. And I think that given what happened to Aeneas personally, after book 6, it's way less about, I mean, you know, by several books after the underworld, we're not having, Aeneas is going to have to speak a different language. He's going to be wearing different clothing. I mean, he loses a lot of his identity as a Trojan. But I think the significance of the first 6 books in terms of identity is not just, you know, Fall of Troy, and you know, we can't have you know, powerful Greek as the forefather of the Romans because that's a threat. You know, why a Trojan? Is this a real hero? I mean, we have a lot of discussions there, but I think that's with this undercurrent of being able to contextualize trauma in a way that is beneficial for both individuals and Romans as a group. So I think there's an individual perspective there, and I think obviously in the United States, regardless of what you think about masks, but you know, it's just sort of, hey, this is, you know, we're not looking at that decision as a collective. Just with the guidance yesterday, it's like, okay, if you want to wear one, you can. I think in many ways, we're in the United States, which is where I'm located in Virginia, very individualistic, extremely individualistic. So I think there's that element, but there's also a collective element. How are we going to get through these events together? What does that mean about the incident? And what does that mean about our identity? Who are we, and how has this informed who we are? And I think the incident, or not the incident, but the episode in book 6 where he's able to see his future, you sort of have this compression and collapsing of time for Aeneas. But if you think of the readers who are down there with him, potentially, depending on what Aeneas remembered, and we don't know, the only people who are taking something away from that are, you know, Vergil's contemporaries in terms of being able to process and contextualize, you know, a recent traumatic event. So I think that that's mostly what I wanted to go over today. I definitely wanted to leave time for questions, although if there's no questions, I can do that thing where I just keep talking. But I definitely wanted to sort of just present a slightly different perspective of trauma in terms of looking at it, not just from a medical model, not to discount the importance of, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, I did both counseling and medicine. You name something medical and treatment oriented, I did that, and I believe it saved my life. On the other hand, as someone who's living, you know, with a history of extreme trauma that, you know, is really disturbing. There's elements to that post-traumatic experience that I just never felt. I never felt like I really could understand. You know, I just felt confused and bewildered. And the quote I had read at the beginning was helpful, but then, you know, when I read the Aeneid after that and re-examined just that one word, Uabit, I just really thought, wow, this really does make sense in terms of a way to process what happens after trauma, both as an individual and obviously we could sort of imagine how that could play out collectively. So with that, if there's questions, we could kind of look at those. I have more examples of the speech in terms of a blueprint, where that language is echoed and that pattern is plays out in other interactions and other monologues and things like that. So
thank you so much, Dani. It was really a wonderful talk, and it sparked so many thoughts in my mind and made me think about things differently, which is great. I think there definitely are questions. I see hands. I invite you to use, if you are Zoom savvy, which you should all be now after years of this, to use the hand raising function for questions, but if you prefer not to speak your question out loud, you can also just write it in the chat. And I think actually Marianne has already done that, so I'll take her question first, and then Essa Schenk and Linda Fabrizio. And if anyone thinks of more questions, feel free to raise your hand or write them out. So Marianne asks, what do you make of Aeneas leaving the underworld out of the gate of false dreams?
Yeah, that's the one where I was thinking, what does that mean? I contacted Joe Farrell because I just feel like he knows everything about the Aeneid and Vergil, and his new book is fantastic. It's called Juno's Aeneid, by the way. I asked him, and he said, yeah, we don't need to know anything. There's a third way. I mean, I think that's something else where I personally like to understand. I like things black and white. I need a solution. I think in general, especially with all the information we have at our fingertips, we are not comfortable with ambiguity. Like, we want to know for sure. But the one thing I thought that I mentioned as like kind of either way, it creates this sort of ambiguity, and it creates this sense of, well, what really happened there, and what does he take with him, and what does he know? And then that's where I thought, you know what, it actually makes more sense for that to be unclear, intentionally unclear, because it's almost like the reader is in on a little secret. Like, they were down there and they know. So regardless of what Aeneas took out with him, the reader knows exactly what Aeneas experienced. So I think that that is sort of where I landed with that particular question.
All right, next on the list, I have Essa, then Linda, and then Amy, and then Griffin. So Essa, you're up.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. That was a really, really interesting talk. And I guess I was wondering a little bit, I have not personally experienced extreme trauma, but am the child of someone who has. And I know that that has like affected my life, just as it's, I mean, obviously my mother's been affected more, but it still had a really big impact on my life. And I was wondering a little bit more about both the, what you were talking about in the him seeing his descendants and how you think that impacted him, but also in the sense of like his son, who I know doesn't have such a big role in the actual book, but like also was, you know, fated to carry on as after him once they got to Latin. And yeah, so thank you again. It was really.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a transgenerational element to trauma. And I think there was, I mean, a lot of research related to that in terms of Holocaust survivors. And I mean, there's been more, just it's not, and I think too, that is a helpful, helpful aspect of being able to read, something like the Aeneid or just other literature, is to sort of get a perspective that's not just here's a list of symptoms you might have, because there's definitely an intergenerational aspect, family unit aspect, community aspect. I mean, especially with the pandemic, it was almost, global aspect there, or even, what's going on right now in Ukraine. I stopped watching the news a while ago, but I did recently see that. And, there's just this sense of trauma going beyond, one individual. And I think that's something Vergil captures really well. But one thing I did like about the Aeneid, I mean, the ending of the Aeneid is a little, it's just what happened to Aeneas, but I think that in terms of taking something from the past, whatever past that is, whether it's a personal past or, another's past, and being able to look at that as something helpful instead of something that is a liability, and using the energy and momentum to move forward versus dwelling in the past or in some chaotic present. I think his blueprint provides for that as well, particularly in the way it does collapse time, not just for Aeneas personally, but across generations.
Thank you. I neglected to ask Meredith's question because I didn't see it. It was in the chat, but I'll ask it now. Meredith Morgan asks, I agree with you on the translation of you vobit as will help, but I'm wondering how else it has been translated otherwise, since that's the literal translation.
Yeah, I can run through that. So the one translator I found that translated as help is Stanley Lombardo. I was super excited because I emailed him and I forgot I had my cell phone number in the signature line. And then he called me like immediately. And I just asked him why he translated as help. And he just said, please, just doesn't make sense. That was his answer. And, but I have a bunch here. So we got one from 1550. To think on this, may pleasure be another day. And I think at a certain point, there's like momentum. And I also know in terms of source material for this or intertextuality, I think sometimes Vergil might be a little smarter than, I mean, I just think there's a sense, oh, because source material for this or some intertextuality, this is a Greek word that always means please, or that supports a notion of please. I think there's been some momentum where people just default to that because it's so ingrained. Anyway, Dryden, an hour will come with pleasure to relate your sorrows past. 1866, John Connington, the suffering will yield as yet a pleasant tale to tell. My tale's not pleasant. Theodore Williams, 1910, it well may be some happier hour will find this memory fair. C.S. Lewis, 1930, someday it will be pastime to recall this woe. So most of them, in English at least. And I also looked at Italian. I looked at some other languages. I mean, it's definitely skewing towards please from what I could see. Lombardo, in terms of recent translations, was a big exception. Oh, David Ferry, 2017. Perhaps there will come a time when you remember these troubles with a smile. Sarah Rudin, someday you may recall today with pleasure. I think Shadi Barsh's new translation, also it's pleasant there. So.
Wow, that was an exhaustive list. Really impressive that you had that right there, Dani. Okay, next on the list is Linda Fabrizio.
Hi, thank you very much. It was just a wonderful presentation. When you mentioned book 2 and the Renoir passage, my mind just jumped to Aeneas being presented very soon after his own pep talk with having to do the hard work of processing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
She just puts that out there and he's confronted with having to, what we usually say is retell or whatever, the sadness, the dolorem. But I thought to myself, renew in the sense of making it new. And I carried my laptop upstairs and got my Lewis and Short and looked up the different meanings. And there are meanings of change, alter, and recreate. And I wondered, I mean, that certainly would be part of that distancing from the trauma as you try to move it from a past present to totally in the past. But it's just so interesting, and it just kind of underscores to me the genius of Vergil without modern psychology, that he puts him, it never occurred to me until today, that he's put immediately into that position of not just retelling it and re-experiencing it, but being challenged with, and it's very fresh. So, well, I don't know, it's 7 years. So it's just interesting. And I wonder if you could comment on that as maybe a possible rendering of recreating, because we know Vergil's use of words is multi-layered, and how much of that is part of the processing of trauma.
Yeah, I hope I remember that. Hold on, let me get my pen. Yeah, I like recreate on that a lot too, because also, I mean, there is a way where when I was a therapist for a brief time, but I really like narrative therapy because you get to choose what your story means, but you also get to choose your story. So I think in terms of recreating it, that allows for a different perspective, maybe in terms of, okay, I didn't fail here, or I did my best, or, you know, just in terms of that context. But he also uses the term when he goes back into the city to find Crisa, and I think there's 7 or 8 iteratives. It's repeto, renovare, reverti versus retro, refero, reviso. And that's what so leading, as he's retelling the story, it's sort of this meta thing where going back to, he's reliving, literally retracing his steps and going back again. So I think there's this idea of recreating, reliving, re-experiencing that just goes beyond, I'm going to tell a sad story. So I like recreate. And I also, just since I went to Catholic, they're very philology oriented. I think sometimes that approach gets, kind of a short end of the stick in modern context, that that's not interesting or we don't want to do that. But, I think language can be very precise, and certainly Vergil and other authors are very intentional about the words they selected. So I like that a lot. And I hadn't thought about recreate. I think there's a lot of possibility there in terms of what he's doing when he retells it and the control he has over the story at that time versus when he was living it.
And the thing too about the more people tell their story, the less it wounds them. That as harmful as it is at the beginning, when we see these young gymnasts and everything retelling their story, they're claiming it and specifically with that situation. But just that retelling of it somehow reduces the pain too. So it's really interesting to me. Thank you for citing.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot, because I was thinking more relive, but that does give him less autonomy. And at the point where he is retelling it, he has probably more control or perceived control than when he was experiencing it. So, and in fact, Renoir, I have to go back and look, because he does use that when he goes back in to find Creset. I'm just wondering if the context and words around it and word position, if that use of renew or recreate is somehow echoed there, and more intentionally than it just being within a couple hundred lines. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Linda. Next is Amy. Amy Peterson.
Hello, thank you, Dani, for this great focus for reading the Aeneid. I really appreciate the new lens to think about how to approach it with my students. I'm wondering about the journey that Aeneas has and how you would relate that to the experience of going through the journey of processing one's traumas and all the stops and starts that he has. And it's paralleled obviously on the Odyssey, but how Vergil tells it and the way things happen for him and how he reacts to it. Do you have any take on that?
Yeah, thanks. Yes. So I'm trying to find a quote in here. So there's been a lot on time, and there's a whole book called Time in the Aeneid, and it's a kind of book where they count the number of different kinds of tenses and how often they occur and things like that. But I guess one of the in terms of there is, as I mentioned, just in terms of if you're teaching AP, I think we're missing a lot. But book 3 is pretty, I think, chaotic in a way as well, just in terms of, if you're looking at books 1, 2, and 3 in particular, the temporal displacement. And one scholar called it like a vertiginous laying of time. And there's one quote I was looking to find here that I had marked. I think it's Rebecca Armstrong had described in the context of book 3. She says that the narrative sequencing moves forward in a circuitous route via inverted chronologies and repetitions in the narrative and setbacks and deja vu in history. And when I read that quote, it really reminded me of the quote I had read at the beginning about traumatic time moving in circles and being sucked backwards. So I think that the overall structure and sequencing of his journey it is chaotic, and it is, I think, frustrating for a novice reader to read, even in English, because of that. And that's where I thought, well, this is obviously intentional, especially if you look at book 6. And I didn't talk about the shield very much, but where Aeneas is standing there with the shield, and he has this whole future on this shield, and he doesn't know. So I think there's this, and who's the audience there? And I think that's similar to book 6, where the reader can see all these things on their founder's shield, and they're in on it in a way that he might not be. So I think that that's something that's intentional and fits with that notion.
All right. Thank you all. Continuing down the line of questioners, Griffin Smith-Nichols is next.
Hi, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I'm curious whether or not you would say that you've encountered anything else in ancient literature that reminds you of how Vergil portrays Aeneas's trauma. Because when I think of so much of the violence in the Iliad, for instance, that's brutish, dehumanizing, and in a lot of ways very impersonal as well. I think that trauma and violence don't necessarily need to make sense. And so it's incredibly difficult to fit them into a coherent narrative in the way that you describe Aeneas doing. Is this something that you find parallels for in other ancient authors, or is it something that is kind of unique so far for you in Vergil?
I think with the time, there's obviously I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, there's other clever, I hate to use the word clever, but there's similar treatments of time. But I think a problem with reading Greek, at least for me, is I really, as soon as the first ancient Greek I read was the Odyssey, and then I read the Iliad, and you know, I was young, and I was like, wow, how, and I think I was just like, oh, this stuff I used to think was good in high school. I mean, I think people can tend to be really dismissive of Vergil. I think what he does with time is really unique. I mean, I looked at a lot, I just have not seen much that is anywhere close to what he's doing. Because he's doing this on an individual level and a collective level. I mean, there's just a lot of layers to it. And especially with the Shield and book 6, I think, and the Frieze even in book 1, or the mural, I think is, I mean, I think there's things that are similar, and I think there's other, you know, treatments of issues that, I mean, I've had students tell me reading Catullus, wow, I've really learned, I was really cringy, you know, when I was trying to date, and I've learned how, you know, I think people can relate to texts in different ways because of different techniques. But I mean, I'd be curious if other people could think of a text, because I read a lot, and I mean, I think Ovid does a lot with Herodes. That's really different, but it's not so much with time. You know, that's more with the perspective. So I can't think of one that's done in the same way, kind of so comprehensively, and what I think is very intentionally.
There's I'll just jump in since you asked, Dani. This is not like me thinking of an ancient text that does something exactly the same as what you're describing, but if anybody doesn't know about the book Achilles in Vietnam, it's probably worth, if you're interested in this, it's worth checking out, because that was a study done by a psychologist of Vietnam vets reacting to reading the Iliad and reading about Achilles. And it deals, I think, with a lot of similar issues and sort of suggests a similar reading. Maybe it's not exactly positing sort of trauma onto the characters in the literature, but it's more like examining trauma in literature via the perspective of people who have experienced it.
Yeah, that is a good resource for sure.
Okay, next up is Mark Reuter. Mark.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. What you said sort of reminded me that I've had this longstanding question that I've always meant to go back to in the Aeneid. And I just want to get your take on this a little bit, just to see. I don't have a really precise question, so I'm just going to try to shake a few things out. But the Latin word tempus seems to me to do double duty for two notions of time that you see more clearly in Greek: chronos for a kind of moment by moment chronological time, and kairos for a more qualitative idea of time, the fitting time or something like that. And I'm sort of coming at this from a wild perspective of Neoplatonism, where, you know, somebody like Plotinus will say that inside of us is part of us inhabits eternity. And I always thought that was a weird thing until I thought about things like trauma, where the past and the present blend together and are so stuck. But so do you, let me try to sort of make this more specific by asking two things. Do you see, because I think Vergil is like in the second preface in the opening of book 7, the second proem, is asking the question about what are the quality of times, the quae tempora rerum, something like that. That he's pushing us to think, not by the way he has all this mixed up chronology, he's pushing us to think about qualitative time, if we could call it that. So just if you have anything if anything of that jumps out at you. And then with the notion of trauma and being stuck going around in circles, isn't in the ancient world, isn't Virgil's conception of time all circular, like in some ways? So just I don't know if anything shakes out. I'd just be curious of your take on that in connection with the Aeneid.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, everything you said are things. I mean, sometimes I just sort of get a headache. As book 6 for sure, and my students are like, wow, that's almost like science fiction. Is it science fiction, or just where you're just sort of trying to map it out, and then I look at it from a different perspective. Okay, for the Virgil's contemporaries, here's how it would look at it. But I think with especially the advent of like 5-day work week, 2-day weekend, I mean, just constructions of time. I read a lot about different constructions of time. And part of it was just, I have personally a very skewed sense of time, which I find embarrassing. I mean, even with weather cues, I'm sort of sometimes like, where am I in the year? And prior to addressing my trauma, I was so rigid and really depended on time to keep me grounded. And then I felt like I just sort of floated away. So I think really, I mean, it definitely got me thinking just beyond trauma and into like time, because I think around that, I mean, there are some really good resources, and I mean, I can maybe provide a little bibliography later, but I mean, there were lots of projects involving time in that general time period, in terms of calendar or being able to count hours during the day. I mean, I think I had read an article about, I think it was brothels, or how are you going to, charging clients, but, trying to come up with smaller units in the day, things that we take for granted. So during that period of time, there was definitely a lot of that thought, and just generally, not Virgil exactly, but just ideas of not necessarily mastering time, but I guess periodization. So coming up with eras, so even just like the golden age, like delineating time and chopping it up, which is inherently violent. You're going to say this starts here and this ends here, whereas Vergil is a lot more, like you said, circular, I think, with less cutting and less segmentation and periodization. So I don't think that's an answer, but that's some things that I thought about when I was reading in terms of what is he doing overall with time. Because obviously if somebody with trauma, I'm like, ooh, I love thinking about trauma, but I definitely was also thinking about time generally. And I think what you said is something that, and the beginning of the book 7 passage for sure. And that's why I kind of stopped at book 6. I mentioned the shield a little in my paper, but I think that that's a good point in terms of what he was doing. And to that end, I was trying to figure out what had been going on with time, not just in terms of the calendar, but in terms of chopping up time in terms of ages, but maybe even also like the day. And the obelisk, is that, I don't know if people don't know for sure if that was a sundial, but obviously there's a sense of controlling and then establishing control through time, and the idea of time being, providing structure, but also being inclusive and exclusive as well when you're chopping up eras and things. So the circularity of it, I think, is more pleasant in a way, even if it's more disorienting, and I think gives more time, more opportunity to look at the concept of time differently.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
that help. But I thought that's interesting. It's interesting to think about for sure, and it's interesting what he's doing. Just especially because some of those ideas tend to get, okay, if you're talking about capitalism and the way we structure time because of capitalism, oh, okay, is that political or whatever? He's obviously challenging notions of time during a period of time where time wasn't as distinct and structured as it is right now.
Thanks for that very interesting exchange. Next up is Zachariah the 68th from from your square. Zachariah, are you there?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that was my name. That makes a lot more sense. But that's a really old inside joke, and I forgot that was me. But I was wondering, just because of forgive me, I've only really read in depth the last part of chapter 12. When you were talking about Aeneas's trauma, I was wondering, how do you think the trauma Juturna experiences and how Vergil describes the beginning of that relates to Aeneas's trauma, because she does have that whole big speech where she does use dolor. And I was wondering how you think that relates to everything, given that there was such heavy emphasis on that in the first 6 chapters of the book.
Yeah, and that's where I thought, okay, because I do think there's some pushback. We're going to use modern medicine to diagnose ancient people. So I think a lot of when I started writing the chapter I was writing, I definitely felt like I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out where Vergil even stood on the notion of trauma. And not so much, Romans, but what is Vergil presenting? And I think he brackets the whole book with it. And as I said before, there's some themes in the speech that reappear. And also in terms of language around trauma that reappears, particularly with the word maestas and ghosts. So I think in terms of other episodes, related to trauma, it's something that really kind of, pervades the book up until the end, because the language in terms of when we meet Aeneas, the part where he's groaning and his limbs grow limp, same language, exact same language at the end of the Aeneid in that Turnus episode. So I think that it's, and I didn't spend as much time in, there were parts of 6 through 12, I spent a lot of time in other parts I haven't. So the passage you mentioned was not one of them, but I definitely recall that passage. And I think that there's ways that there are certain structures that Vergil sets up in the beginning that are kind of a through line throughout the book, and so far as characters addressing or dealing with or even causing trauma.
Gracias.
Thanks. And I'd just like to, that's the end of our list, but I'd just like to make one comment if I could before we close, which is that, so I guess you've got me thinking about the word trauma and its historical usage, Dani, and I did some Googling earlier. And I think we're using trauma in a Freudian way here. Like, I think we're sort of referring to trauma as a kind of psychological wound, which then is repressed and causes neurosis, maybe. And so I just looked into like Freud and Freud's thoughts about this, and I was reminded that a big part of Freud's theory was that neurosis was caused by trauma that was unremembered. So specifically things that happened to you as a child. And he was in fact talking about sexual abuse in his theory of seduction, which then was not remembered by the victim and produced what he called hysteria, which is a sort of dated use of the term. But remembering what happened was a big part of his theory for how we could solve these psychological conditions. And so that made me think, of course, about the verb meminisse in there. So it fits nicely with a sort of Freudian reading. But then I also thought, of course, there's a meta-literary element to what Aeneas says as well, right? Because he says, "Forsan olim et haec meminisse juvabit," and we are in fact also remembering the things that happened to him, and it is pleasing to us.
It's pleasing and helpful too. So.
and this, of course, also feels creepily relevant to me anyway. I don't know how many else of you all are watching what's happening in Ukraine on Twitter. I am I can't stop. And one of the things that's like so sickening to me about the whole thing is the fact that everybody's watching it on Twitter as if it were a action movie or something, and there are heroes and villains and things like that. And it just so psychologizing the experience of sort of suffering and redemption and how we make sense of that with literature or literary-esque cultural productions is all extremely helpful, as it were,
Yeah.
for me. So I just want to thank you for that, because it's like, it's helpful thinking about ancient literature, but it's also helpful just thinking about like suffering and culture and how we interface with it. So wonderful, awesome talk, and awesome topic in the true sense of the word. I think there's really a lot to process. So I don't see any other questions. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking Dani for this wonderful work and this really interesting and useful discussion. Yes, you can all make various forms of approbation silently via Zoom. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that there is another one of these talks coming up. I'm trying to remember the date. It's coming up in a few weeks. And this one is going to be from a guy named Chaz Libretto, who is a playwright. Ironically, he is a musical theater writer named Libretto. He's written a number of productions of ancient, like adaptations of ancient literature to the stage. Most hilariously, a rock opera based on Euripidean satyr play, the Cyclops, which I saw in New York when it was on, and it was fabulous. You know, think satyrs with electric guitars and goatskin chaps. So don't miss that one, and please subscribe to our mailing list for further updates on talks like this, which we do. One of the nice relics of the pandemic will be this series, which we intend to keep doing, pretty much every month, at least from now on. So hope to see you all there. Thanks again, Dani. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.